All right, and welcome once again for our sixth panel of today. Can't believe it's already our last panel, but we are so delighted to end with such strong group of speaker and panelists on a very important and current topic. The topic is U.S. battery policies and responsible sourcing. And I will now welcome to the stage our moderator for today's panel, Olderico. If you could just join me now. And Olderico will introduce all our panelists today and lead what I'm sure will be a very fascinated discussion. So, without further ado, let me introduce you, Alderico, as a battery research lead at Romotion. You provide informed technical and market insights into energy storage technologies, and you support a wide range of firms active in banking, finance, and in the energy storage sector to help them on their energy transition journey. Before joining Remotion, you worked at Nissan Motor, where you managed the project portfolio on next generation energy storage technology at the Nissan Technical Center in Europe. So happy to have you with us. And with that, I will let you introduce our wonderful panelists today.
Thank you, Amandine. Thank you for the kind invitation and for letting me moderate this very exciting discussion today. So I know you guys had a very intense day. It's nearly a marathon, I would say, but we will try to keep this interesting and engaging. The topic is very, very, very timely. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I wanted to just give you a bit of background about the discussion today. So today we will talk in this panel about US battery policies and responsible sourcing. Just last week I was in Michigan in Nova at the battery show, and there was a lot of buzz. I think everybody was talking about the recent changes in policies. We talk a lot with automotive OEMs, and I think the last month has been crazy, if you want, with the Inflation Reduction Act happening. So just to our speakers will talk more about the like the beef of today's discussion, but just to give you some numbers on what's happening today in the US. Again, US lithium-ion cell production is set to expand from 59 gigawatt hours in 2020 to 350 gigawatt hours by 2026. So it's a 6% increase, and this data come from the DOE, the Department of Energy. Automotive OEMs planning to invest 71.5 billions of dollars just to favor the energy transition, the switch to EVs. And we have a lot of builds coming online. We will talk about those, but just to give you again some numbers, we have about $7 billion for processing and manufacturing, ballpark by the government, and 7 billion for recharging infrastructure, roughly. There's a lot of nitty-gritty, and the speakers later on will talk about this. And it's not easy. So again, the panel today, if you consider all these variables, all these complex really nuances with the legislations, there is quite a lot to unravel, and I'm really excited today of the really speakers that we have. So now that you understand hopefully our background, I'm really happy to introduce our speakers. So we have Emma Bishop, who is Assistant Vice President at Penn Strategies, and she's a nationally recognized full service government relations and public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. So she works on with a range of different clients in the energy and transportation sectors, and she leads a large number of very interesting and exciting initiatives like the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition. I'm sure Emma will be able to tell us more during her intro. We have Ellen Carey. Ellen has dedicated her career to advocating for clean energy technologies. She's been running successful campaigns for technologies such as electric vehicles, renewable energy, and really has been playing a key role in shaping and understanding the key market dynamics and really trying to create favorable business opportunities. She held a series of senior positions in cell manufacturing and automotive OEMs. We have Samsung, Audi of America, American Wind Energy Association. So really a internationally renowned expert. And last but not least, Steve Levine is editor of The Electric, where he writes on the future impacts of batteries, electric vehicles, and autonomous mobility. Steve doesn't need, I think, introduction. He's world renowned for all the publication that he has done, the books, and he formerly founded and ran the Future newsletters at Axios, was a foreign correspondent at Wall Street Journal, New York Times. He's now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council for Site, Strategy and Risk Initiatives, and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. And I'm sure all of you know the one of his most famous book, The Powerhouse, America, China, and the Great Battery War. So with this amazing background and lineup of speakers, I will now hand over to them. And Emma, I'd like you to introduce a bit yourself and give us a bit more color about today's discussion.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies for my weird video. I'm trying to, find the best setup possible in a hotel room, which I'm sure many of you are sympathetic for. So I just want to start by thanking the Battery Associates, and thank you, Alderico, for that introduction and for making today's panel possible. A brief introduction. My name's Emma Bishop, and I'm an assistant vice president at Venn Strategies, which is a government affairs firm in Washington, D.C. There I work with the Battery Materials and Technologies Coalition, BMTC, as well as many other wonderful companies, including Ellen Carey with Circular, on all things Washington and federal policy in the United States. And so as a bit of background, I'm relatively new to the battery space. I've only been working in this issue area for about 3 years. Have more background in the energy space prior to that. But more specifically, in the past 2 years in getting involved with the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition, became really entrenched in the work that went into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, as well as more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think excited today to spend some time talking through those and unpacking them. At a high level, when we started BMTC and we're advocating in this place in 2021, our focus was, how do you get funding to the agencies that's focused on scaling capabilities, right? So DOE, for instance, Department of Energy in the US, is really well known for its R&D capabilities and for innovation. But looking at what's happening around the world, the focus is we need to be scaling these industries as well. And so that was our focus last year, is how do you get funding in the door that's focused on scale and not just innovation. And so that was what we focused on, that led to the inclusion of $6 billion in funding in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, focused on grants for battery material processing and manufacturing. So to your point, Alderico, that's part of that $7 billion total that goes to batteries from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. So I think excited to talk about that. And then more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, and really how we've seen policy build off the past 10 years, right? Thinking back on 2008, 2009, there was a lot of investment in this space. Then we didn't really see a lot happening, but now we're seeing renewed messaging around the need for national security concerns, onshoring with our allies, and both domestically as well, and thinking through the economic opportunity here in the US with the Biden administration focused on job growth in particular. How can the battery industry be a real key part of that message? And so excited to unpack that more with you all today, and dive in on the different policies play there. So I'll pause and let everyone get through their intros, and then I'm sure we'll dive in a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Ellen?
Hi, thank you. Alderico, thank you for hosting, and Battery Associates. I think very highly of this whole program in virtual day that the battery industry gets to have together, and appreciate too that it's getting more and more international, because that's incredibly important. So my name is Ellen Carey. I'm the Vice President for Global Policy and Public Affairs. I spent a decade in Washington, D.C., and now I'm in Europe with a global purview over what are the policies that are affecting the battery industry, and specifically calling for transparency and traceability within that industry. As Ulrike mentioned, I've been in clean energy policy and business for 15 years now, which is scary to say. And so very familiar. I think over the past, as Emma mentioned, over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of battles to win this war of the $370 billion that's going into the Inflation Reduction Act. Whether it be clean energy or whether it be energy as a whole, US, for our international audiences who might not be as familiar, we've always incentivized it a lot through the tax code. And so that's really exciting. And what those battles were in terms of extending the production tax credit for renewables and extending the investment tax credit for renewables, those were very important campaigns in terms of, yes, continuing to invest in clean energy, but also now be at the place where we're going to have 10 years and the most historic investment in clean energy. Now, I think, as Emma mentioned, there are really important undertones of resilient supply chains, transparency, visibility, ensuring that production is done within North America, the US, and among allies. So that's really important in terms of implementation of what's in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, et cetera. And that's more that we can all talk about here today. I think I'd also be curious, we can pull in also, where do we see similarities globally, right? And what are those interconnections? And that will be also incredibly interesting to discuss, and I think valuable for the audience.
Thank you, Ellen and Steve.
Thanks, Ulrike. It's great to be here today. Emma and Ellen have done a really good job, painting the picture of what we're looking at. I just want to say a couple things. One is just underscoring how massive, how big the program is. The two laws, the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate bill in scale. It's around, it's hard to count everything up because we don't know how many credits will be used over the years, but I'm estimating between the two bills for batteries about $100 billion. And that's about the number that it's estimated that China has spent over the last 15 years to stand up its battery and EV industry. So it's a lot of money. And if you look at American history of industrial history of bouts of throwing money to stand up one industry or another, it's one of the biggest industrial investments in not just clean power, in any industry in history, and so that's big. And that's good. A problem that I wanted to raise is that there's a bias in the bill, in how it's being in the laws, and how they're being carried out, and that's letting industry lead the way. And this is we become captives of our own buzzwords, of our ideologies, and in this case, it's what happened during the last round of this during the Obama administration, and that's Solyndra, and there have been other cases where this kind of policy can go awry. Look, we've seen over the last decade that industry got it wrong. Tesla and China are way in the lead on getting EVs and batteries going. The rest of the industry got it wrong, and so deciding that industry knows the way on batteries now, I think is a big gamble. And one just naming one thing that they're getting wrong is LFP, there's a very good chance that in the second half of the decade, the country is going to be left without enough LFP batteries. And the law, I'll just end here. The law, the Inflation Reduction Act, penalizes LFP. I'll end that there.
I agree with your points, Stephen. It's one of the key things we have to touch on, I think, later on in the discussion. But thank you all for the great introduction. So let's try to dive in, because we also don't have so much time now left. Just to kick off the discussion, I think, I mean, your introduction really did set the scene very well. But for our audience, because I like how you, Steve, said, like, there are a lot of buzzwords. I think IRA and Bipartisan Act are the buzzword of the moment in the policy space. To clarify and that our audience, can we shed some light on what really these policies are, these laws are, why they're important, how they can impact in practical terms the battery value chain? What are the key highlights from both the pieces, if you want, and more broadly, if there are other key points to highlight, really? I don't know who wants to start, maybe Emma?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, so I'll start with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was signed a little under a year ago by President Biden, so last fall. I think what's notable thinking about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is that first word, it's bipartisan. And I think that says something about where the US is going in terms of energy policy broadly, and thinking about supply chains is, we see a lot about political division in the US, and I think that gets a lot of traction on the news globally. But really on the ground, you are seeing some bipartisan understanding around the need for energy security as the real framework behind how this policy is coming together. And so the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was really crafted by 20 senators, both Republican and Democrat, who came together and decided to outline with the Biden administration the infrastructure and energy priorities that they want to make sure get across the finish line. I think that's something to keep in mind as we think about how has energy policy built off of that since then. So we have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It builds on existing programs and also stands up new programs, mostly grant or loan focused, so getting money to companies, with large provisions, as you've mentioned, going towards both batteries, processing and manufacturing of materials, electric vehicle deployment, charging infrastructure, right? So there's a lot going into creating this whole ecosystem. After we have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, you see the CHIPS and Science and Innovation Bill come through. I'm not going to talk about that as much. I'm less of an expert on it. It deals more with semiconductors. But I think it's noteworthy to see, once again, you're seeing another big investment in critical infrastructure in the US. And then a couple months after that, you have the Inflation Reduction Act come through. And so multiple bills are passed within a year, which is just unheard of in the US and in DC, where you're seeing these major investments. And I think both Ellen and Steve touched on this. These discussions have been there and they've been happening, but what's different is the scale to which they're occurring and the urgency with which they're happening. And I think that's what we're seeing really shift recently. To Ellen's point, and I'd love for the others to chime in more on the differences here, the Inflation Reduction Act is predominantly a tax bill. So different than the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is grant and loan focused. Inflation Reduction Act has some boost to the DOE loan program and others as well, but predominantly is focused on tax mechanisms and how to incentivize development of industries through those financial mechanisms. And so now you're seeing this really robust series of policies where companies are thinking through, how do I apply for a DOE loan for one project, a grant for another, and at the same time make sure these are eligible for the tax credits that we're seeing now coming down the road. And then finally, I'd add the final consideration to keep in mind with all of this is the programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are mostly 5-year programs. So this isn't a one and done situation. The money's going to keep coming out the door over the next 5 years. And then similarly with the Inflation Reduction Act, most of those tax credits are 10-year programs. So again, you're seeing this longevity of investment and commitment from the US government. That being said, I think there's still a lot to discuss on what more is needed, right? So I'll pause there, but I think those are some good considerations to keep in mind as we think about the framework that's been laid over the past year.
So Olderico, let me marry up with that. Emma and I can do this well. So she mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that was November of last year. Well, let's go back a little bit further to the executive order out of the White House back in February on American supply chains, right? That gave focus onto batteries, critical minerals and materials, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, et cetera. Now, then passage of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, and then this past February is increasingly looking at, well, how do we gain visibility into those supply chains? And so we saw on the anniversary in February of this past year of that American supply chain executive order, a call from the DOE and the White House for digitalization of key minerals, materials, and supply chains, for transparency, for energy security. So we're seeing this as a foundational theme throughout. Then around the same time, you see Senator Manchin say on the Senate Natural Resources Committee, saying, if we're going to source these things abroad, transparency is a prerequisite. I think that's verbatim. Now, so those are seed sowing that had really, we're seeing a big shift in the implementation of what was the EV tax credit to now the clean vehicle tax credit, and that dole out of federal funds to the purchase of an electric vehicle. And so we saw some indicators, and now we're seeing in Section 30D of the Inflation Reduction Act that qualifying for that clean vehicle tax credit requires more, right? So you're going to take that $7,500 that you could receive back in your taxes from the US federal government, and that vehicle that you purchase is going to have to meet two parts of requirements. $3,750 for the sourcing of critical minerals across nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and graphite, and a value of those over time. Again, as Emma said, it's not just here and done, we're looking over the next 10 years, right? And then the other half of that $7,500 being for component manufacturing, and that being done in North America. So we're seeing, just to marry on top and layer on top of a very nice rundown from Emma on all these policies, is increasing, well, how are we getting to that national and economic and energy security demand and desire that actually spreads across both parties in both House and Senate and get some things done?
Steve, would you like to add something to what's really been drawn?
Yeah, I would like to just something. Thanks, Olderico. And that's that. One thing I think that's super important, vitally important, is that the folks who are running the show think of the year 2030, and when we get to that year and look back, what do they want to see, right? What does that battery industry look like approximately, and make sure that when we get there, that it's not, the money hasn't all been frittered away, in a lot of, we can think of all the ways that things can go wrong, but so just briefly, when I talk to people who are involved in this effort, they know, like, approximately, according to estimates, how much nickel, how much lithium, how much cobalt, and so on is going to be required for the number of EVs that's estimated will be built in the United States in the year 2030. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist then to do the math. Okay, how many cathode active material plants, at what size is it to make that, and so on, right, across the value chain. But I see a real hesitancy, hesitance to make sure that, okay, you've got, so many applications coming in for this money, in mining, in processing, in building. Do they fulfill all of those spaces? Will we end up in 2030 with the industry that we're seeking to set up? So when I bring this up, I get like a blank look, and so it makes me think that that's not happening.
Yeah. So Emma and I are here in Pittsburgh, and it's the Global Clean Energy Action Forum that's hosted by the Department of Energy. And I think there are still a number of questions around the Inflation Reduction Act and how that gets implemented. And I think Emma can speak to where's the gray area that remains, right? I think on top of your question, or on top of your statement, Steve, it's not just there's dual dialogue going on, because we realize we got to walk and chew gum at the same time. So we got to do the near term, we got to do the catch up on the last 10 years, right? And then we've got to plan for the future technologies, and we've got to invest, and we have to collaborate, and we have to go there. And how does that look like? And that's some of the conversations and question marks that I think the industry is putting out on the table with government, et cetera, on what we do.
I would add Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who leads the U.S. Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee, spoke this morning. And he made an interesting point that I hadn't thought of yet, but Steve, your commentary gets to this, which is, Senator Manchin is pushing for permitting reform. It was part of, on his side, the negotiation deal around the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't really want to go down the permitting reform rabbit hole because it's a whole different discussion. But I do want to note, I think an interesting point in his commentary this morning was, you think about the Inflation Reduction Act and its 10-year timeline on tax credits, but then you think about the average time it takes for a mine to be permitted in the United States, and it raises the question of just how many projects would even be able to benefit from the tax credits if permitting is taking such a significant portion of time during the next decade to even get our critical mineral processing and manufacturing facilities up and running. And I don't have an answer to it, but I think it was an interesting component to the discussion around when you're thinking through this timeline and all the domestic requirements for sourcing around the tax credits, how are we actually meeting that? And I think it gets to your point, Steve, about we aren't really strategically, going through and saying, well, we need X of this and Y of this. And so does that leave the U.S. open to continued national security concerns?
I think there are a lot of valuable points here, and it's actually bringing me a bit to my next point, if you want, because when we look at the bill in particular, and the proposal for the IRA, for example, we saw the budgets, and to us it seemed like it was a bit short on the ambition. And as you said, we need to consider these timelines to set up not only money. We know it as maybe a 5-7 years lead time, but cell manufacturing, in the technology. So do you think in general that the calculations are there yet? It's a bit maybe a controversial question on my side, but do you think as we stand now, have we got all the parts of the puzzle in place, or there's still a significant risk? Do we have enough resources put from the government and from OEMs to really be competitive with China? And then I will ask about China in a bit, but I wanted to first get your impression on this. It can be a yes or no, or
I mean, my gut quick answer is, Steve brought up Solyndra earlier. I think this is one of, the past year and a half marks one of the largest investments from the US government in critical infrastructure industries, including those that we don't have a large presence in, like critical materials, right? So I think there is a question mark and a concern coming from the federal government as well, is they want to see what happens over the next few years. And, in their mind, they've given the incentive, they're giving the support and funding. So let's see what happens over the next few years in terms of standing up an industry before kind of reassessing again. And so that's kind of my quick take is I think we see the risk that is still there with they will invest in a lot of projects, and among those there will still continue to be winners and losers, right? And so thinking through how long term are you still creating a robust industry, even though in the short term you might see some of those kind of ups and downs in standing up a new sector.
So I was working in renewables in 2012 when Solyndra went bankrupt, and it caused, so much discernment across the whole space, so much skepticism. And of course, then it paused efforts within the loan guarantee office. And that's a decade ago. We're talking 2012, right? So we've got to understand that we're going into a new frontier. We're going into new challenges. We have to win today and position for the future. And that's risky. That's risky. And the culture and the approach on that will have to be, yes, some things won't work out, but we can't be afraid of the one project that doesn't work out that then creates criticism across the board. This is how this will happen, and we're going to have to take those risks.
I don't know, Steve, if you want to add something to these, or maybe we can also start picking up on the foreign entities of concern, which is the other part, and the LFP story, if you want, which I found very interesting. So I don't know if you want on what you want to touch on.
Yeah, I can say something on that. What's this all about? This is all geopolitics. I mean, there has been for several years a move to decouple the U.S. First, it was a geopolitical move, and China, and now it's economic too, and there are all kinds of rationales for this, and I think a good even short of decoupling, it's one of the savvy things about setting up an EV industry is that you have your supply chain close at hand, so there doesn't have to be decoupling for that reason. But there is one thing that I did want to say, and then hand it over to Emma and Ellen, is that the U.S. is going to have to find a way to work with China on this. China is the biggest maker of battery materials in the world, the biggest battery maker in the world. It's the one that has the talent, the skills, that knows how to do this. It's just quite simple. This decade, the 2020s, we will not be able to stand up to make anywhere near the number of EVs that we want to make and batteries that we need to make for their EVs without the Chinese. And so there's going to have to be some kind of a modus vivendi where CATL, BYD, Goshen are permitted to work in North America or in the US, and that can be a very high percentage requirement for them to use the local supply chain. But that's something, it's a third rail of politics, but it's just reality.
Ellen, Emma, do you want to add something to the points of Steve?
I mean, completely. I feel like weekly now I read an article that says, the US can't do it without China, and another article at the same time that says this is the time and the opportunity and we can do it if we really put our heads to it, and so I think this conflict is really playing out among, various groups, everyone is having the same debate and discussion. I think what comes to mind to me is where is the space for us to carve out work with our allies and maybe shift the lens and focus on this conversation to instead, how is the US in working with allied nations creating its own system and supply chain for battery materials? And I think that's the conversation you're starting to see more in DC, is thinking through who are our closest and most strategic allies in this space, and how do we benefit from that? And a notable program separate from the legislation we talked about today is the Department of Defense's DPA Title III program, Defense Production Act. And this year, Australia and the UK were added with Canada as listed domestic sources of critical materials. And I think that's a really noteworthy shift coming from our Defense Department, is thinking through how are we working with our allies when we think about building critical material supply chains. And I know Ellen has a lot of thoughts on this as well, from kind of the tracking of sustainable materials and thinking through how our allies play a role in that as well. But I think there's a kind of that shift, and instead of thinking about how is China controlling, it's instead how can we build with allies to create something together that is competitive with China.
And maybe, Ellen, can you talk a bit on this point on Europe, I think, connecting to Emma's point?
Sure. I would just say, you know, like Emma and the VIN team have their work cut out for them between now and the end of the year, because there's lots of gray area in the Inflation Reduction Act, like when it says extracted or processed, down to the 2 letters, or what does that mean? Or a foreign entity of concern, what does that mean? What's the percentage? When you say value of minerals and material, how is that going to be processed? So a lot of that is in the process of getting done. We're expecting draft guidelines from the Department of Treasury and others and the administration in the next couple months, and final by the end of the year for rollout. So some of this gray area, pure and simple, has to get sorted out. Now, so I mean, I think I said it yesterday on a panel, is that like the US kind of joined the party in terms of marking batteries, wanting to know where they came from, their proof of provenance, sourcing, and manufacturing. That's what Europe has been focused on in a different way, different methodology since before 2020 with the EU battery directive in its form then. So it's I think in that sense, they're very much of the same mind and spirit in terms of these are valuable assets. We need to know where they came from. We need to know that they weren't used with forced child labor, etc. And we want proof of that, and we want to share that proof also with our customers. So I think what's really interesting, whether it be the EU battery passport in Europe or the clean vehicle tax credit, that information is now going to go to consumers like you and me. And that's very fascinating.
Great. Thank you all already for your great points. Looking at the time, we'll now move to questions from the audience, and we'll start by with Esteban Garcia's question, who asks, going back to the US on the federal government front, looking how the skilled labor scenario is looking, and what is actually needed in terms of skilled labor scenario for this transformation to happen. Shouldn't these acts be followed by synergistic training and immigration programs, etc.? If anyone would like to jump in on Esteban's question, feel free to do so now. Just speak up.
Emma, you want to take this one or start it off?
I can kick us off. I think the first thing that comes to mind, and this is a new initiative, is the White House recently launched a workforce training initiative that they're doing, and the purpose is to coordinate with state and local entities on workforce development needs. And they highlight a number of critical infrastructure sectors that they want to focus on, one of which is batteries and electric vehicles. And so, you know, at a high level across the agencies, there's this new push for coordination coming out of the White House with various agencies and then states and even municipalities around what are the needs and opportunities to focus on workforce development. But I'll keep it pretty high level because I would say Ellen and Steve might have some better input on the ground.
Well, I know this is a key focus of the LIBridge initiative as well, right? So LIBridge being DOE, NatBat, NYBest, and another, plus industry groups looking at how do we bridge between government initiatives that, DOE, but others within, labor, Department of Labor, et cetera, to get upskilled for this. And I think they're coming to very clear and concrete actions that the industry and government need to do to skill up.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit on this, that I have been looking at this recently, and this issue of the skills shortage. So the U.S. and Europe also have not. This is a new industry for both the number number that's out there, 10 million. This industry will need 10 million workers by 2030 globally, and 800,000 in Europe by 2025. And also tens of thousands in the United States. There's a desperation, right? In company, I'm talking to companies and to the colleges where those companies are based, and people are starting to move on this, but it'll take time. It'll take the whole decade, right, to ramp up. It's as big. It's as big a challenge as the supply chain challenge.
Absolutely. And a shameless plug here on the Battery MBA or 12 weeks course, because we definitely do believe that training a skilled workforce is an imperative in this transition. So we do strongly believe and agree with you on the training front. And with that, I'll let Ulderico close this panel with perhaps some closing remarks. And already, thank you very much.
Thank you, Amandine. I think we could talk for hours of each of the single topic points we touched on. I think 45 minutes was really not enough, unfortunately, but at least we managed to touch on some of the nuances. I think there is still a lot more we should say about US policies, but hopefully the audience has been able to really get the important points and some of the errors of the past, what are the risks and what are the opportunities as well. Maybe we will ask Amandine and Simon and the team to schedule another discussion panel.
Absolutely.
To continue. But with that, I really want to thank Ellen and Steve for joining us today to discuss these topics, and again to the Battery Associates organization for organizing. And to that, I don't know, Ellen, Emma, Steve, if you want to say something as closing remark.
Well, thank you for having us. Thank you for the interest. I'm a big fan. Emma hears this all the time. As an American abroad, I'm very personally passionate about this sharing of information and what we're seeing across the industry in our different regions. And that's critically important to the global advancement of this industry.
Others have, go for it, Emma.
Thinking ahead, something to keep in mind for everyone, we kind of touched on it and Ellen mentioned this is just the beginning of the discussion, right? A lot is continuing in the US, and in particular, our Treasury Department and White House and others have until the end of this year to provide guidelines on how they want to see the Inflation Reduction Act actually implemented. And so I think a lot of the questions the industry has around how are we defining certain materials, or, where are we cutting things off, foreign entities of concern, all of that, we're expecting more clarity in the next few months. And so I think really keep your eyes peeled for announcements coming out of the administration on how we're going to be tracking materials, defining materials, implementing these tax credits. There is a lot more to be seen. So it's an exciting time.
Great. Steve?
Yeah, I'm just reflecting, even if there are nitpicks, right? That you know that everything isn't exactly right, and there's room for improvement. Just thinking about how over the last 3 years, the U.S. has gone really from zero to well, you know, pick your number, but a lot, not very, very far in terms of understanding the challenge, where it should be, where it can be, and there's a lot of potential to for this to end up in the right place.
Thank you all so much for this great conversation. And as Alderico suggested, we'll definitely be sure to have a round two of on that particular topic, and much more to explore the international frameworks as well, and the changing regulation globally. But thank you already, all four of you, for your time and providing these great insights today. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Next will be the next or last round of the deep dive sessions. So there are 3 topics that will happen in parallel in the next or in 5 minutes from now. As previously, if you were with us in the European section, you'll basically be able to choose one of those 3 topics, and you can, of course, move around sessions, but we recommend that you stay. Those sessions are fairly short. They are 40-minute long. So the 3 topics are the battery report presented by the Volta Foundation, but also the battery brunch, and then a battery cycler, which is a battery associates project, and last but not least, a battery sector recruitment trend presented by one of our sponsor, Arvensis Search. So please join the sessions. All you need to do is after this to just go to the sessions part of the event. And we look forward to seeing you there and then, and after that for our closing remarks of today's event. See you all soon, and thanks again for joining.